Assalamu alaikum, everybody, and welcome back to Connections with Sheikh Idris, our ongoing conversation here, where we are exploring the intersection of healing and Islamic spirituality and our lifestyle here as human beings navigating the um, challenges of the modern world. Alhamdulillah. So, this is the second episode of season two. And we thought to just begin early on with a question and answer. So this is a question that was sent in to us. I think it was sent in to Sheikh Idris actually. And it goes as follows. Quote, what does Islam say about how one relates unhealthily to God or Islam post-trauma due to the impacts it can have on one's perception of self, others, religion, and God? I like that question a lot. I think it's a very good question. I think a lot of us, a lot of my patients for sure, in some way or other express this same kind of dilemma, this internal dilemma they feel in terms of how am I supposed to, with whatever's coming up for me, with my relationships and my ibadah and my worship and living with my parents, all these sorts of things, how am I supposed to maintain this good perception of God when I'm really suffering and it seems like the whole world's collapsing on me and so forth. And, one of the things that I often tell people is we need to be able to heal so that our love for God, our relationship with Allah Ta'ala can be real, right? And in some way, this is something that it kind of just always comes back down to that the need to be real, the need for us to heal the wounds that have fragmented us from our relationships to ourselves and to Allah Ta'ala, because those things are always connected. And, we find, these um, hadiths of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam where he says, um, uh, in terms of having husn dhan billah, and the hadith escapes me now, subhanallah. Um, uh, hadith Qudsi Sidi on Allah Ta'ala being as you are. It's escaping me.
أنا عند
أنا عند
ظن
ظن عبدي بي.
ظن
Yeah,
عبدي
نعم.
بي.
أنا عند ظن عبدي بي. I am in the opinion of my slave.
Mm.
I am in the opinion of my servant. So people will beat themselves up. Like, I have actually a pretty negative opinion of God.
Mm.
And is that how God is with me? And am I stuck now in this vicious cycle? Because Allah is reflecting my reality, and my reality is really dark and grim and negative. And so how do I get out of this? And I tell, that's a wonderful question. And it's true that the relational matrix that we have within us, kind of piggybacking on our last conversation on the fitra, is something that really reaches all of our relationships, our relationship with self, our relationship again with our family, our friends, our coworkers, our neighbors, our pets. I mean, all of that, and ultimately to God Himself. It's just one relational web, and it's a lens, and it's an energy that we bring, and that we receive. We can filter out and filter in, but it's an energy that comes in and out regardless. And so that becomes the work for us to be able to open up to really who we are and connect to really what's been done to us and the effects, and to understand the effects of what has happened to us, and for us to be able to move forward in that way.
Mm.
Separation is really the calling card of trauma. Separation from ourselves, separation from God. It is the first wound. It is the main wound, is separation. And the story of separation is something that dominates much of the Western discourse. Um, but connection, usul, ittihad, oneness, wholeness, these are the things that we want to be able to come back to constantly. And in that reclaim, ultimately, that relationship that we're all yearning for with Allah Ta'ala and those around us. So we'll kind of just leave it at there for the introduction. Inshallah ta'ala. Sayyidi, assalamu alaikum.
Yes.
Um, how do you begin to orient to this question about relationship with our traumas and our relationship with Allah ta'ala?
Um, I mean, we can look at this from many different perspectives. So when this question was posed initially, I was like, where do I go with this one? Because it really does depend what comes up for the client.
Yeah.
Because fundamentally, I think when we're looking at trauma here, we're looking at someone's experiencing overwhelm and they can't handle something. And so what's the reaction to that in that person? And the way I've understood it and the way I've experienced it with clients is that you either, when you can't handle something and it becomes overwhelming, then you either project it inwardly, i.e. you attack yourself, or you can project it outwardly. These are two manifestations of it. You project it outwardly to say someone's to blame for this or something's to blame for that. And so it's just, I think, first and foremost, being aware that that's going to be a reaction potentially in you. And that, so when you are, if people, for example, have are impacted by trauma in their life and they're overwhelmed, that when they start to question God, understand the underlying the processes, what's what's going on there, is that you are struggling to handle this. So you are obviously, first and foremost, one of the most classic trauma responses to things that usually gets people stuck is, I need to understand this. And that can be quite dangerous. First of all, we normalize it. We say it's quite normal for you want to understand it, because if I can understand it, then I suppose you assume that you're going to be able to solve it and be able to handle it. And there's some element of truth to that, because if we understand something, we do feel like we contain it to some degree. But also that trying to understand it may become a barrier in the process of healing, because it's protecting you from, or it's preventing you from being able to actually sit with the hurt that you're feeling. And you trying to understand why God, Allah, has brought this into your life. Understand, it's an understandable response, but is it going to bring you the healing that you want? And so it's tackling it, looking at it from many different perspectives. And I always use a pivotal hadith about this. I always quoting this one, is the Prophet ﷺ addressed this issue straight away in the death of Ibrahim, his son, where he said, look, I'm gonna, my eye cries, so there's a somatic, the physiological experience of it. My heart feels grief, there's the emotional connection to it, but we don't say anything that doesn't displease my Lord, i.e. this isn't the place and time for you to try to cognitively understand these things. So I think it's really important that people understand that, and in the end they need to be supported. Because if you're overwhelmed by something, you can't hold it, so you need to be held. And so the Prophet ﷺ dealt amazingly with this. If you, in our tradition, is as soon as someone's lost a loved one, what do? They do nothing. The community comes in, and we hold it for them, so that they can almost feel that there is support around them, so they can grieve and process the grief effectively, or they can process the grief without having to really become distracted. Because I've seen that many a time, is that the grief gets stuck when we get distracted, because we've got to take responsibility for the burial. We've got to take responsibility for feeding people. We've got to take responsibility for taking the body back to the homeland, and so forth and so forth. It's what do people need in trauma fundamentally, is for the community to come physically and make people feel like they're being held. And it's about coming to terms with that. And that's our work as therapists, is that they feel our psychological, emotional, physiological, spiritual support. And so in the end, it's them feeling that us tending to them, that's half the healing, that they can feel. Absolutely. Someone's not judging them, someone's not trying to convince them to, or someone's not trying to make them feel better. You're just holding, and you're trying to understand their phenomenological experience, and say that must be really difficult if you hold it for them. and they feel that then they can almost let go of what they've been holding on to, because finally I can actually sit with this because you're staying with me in this.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the healing comes. But when that's not understood and that's not it's not channeled in that way, that's where a lot of it becomes a dangerous area for people religiously, because they can really start questioning and going down that route of becoming confused in their relationship with Allah, confused in themselves in their relationship with Allah. Maybe I did something wrong and I deserve this. Does Allah hate me?
Yeah.
It can turn
And
those both ways.
and when I hear you talking about that, you mentioned earlier the projection out and the projection in, or
Yeah.
some have called it acting out and acting in. That injection of shame and self-hatred can oftentimes be that very kind of glue that keeps us stuck and disconnected from being open to being held by Allah. Like the doctor-patient relationship is or the counselor-client relationship, or whatever healing relationship that exists, can be such a great stepping stone for us, that like maybe the sheikh murid relationship, the sheikh and disciple kind of relationship can be um, too much, maybe, or bring up too much, or our parents, we're not really allowing whatever the parental relationship is not as healthy as it could be. In that doctor-patient relationship, there can be another kind of space where that holding can take place, because ultimately it was the lack of that holding that allowed that acting in, acting out dynamic. And then this false binary of like, if I allow me in whatever way, if I connect to me, if I speak, if I were to connect to my actual feelings, there's a badness there. And so to be good, I need to suppress this. And so there's a false binary that can emerge where it's like the person wants nothing more than to connect with themselves and to heal and to be well. But then there's all this identification, this negative identification and labeling and objectification even of their own selves, where they can't allow themselves to go beyond that shame because they're bad. And if they're, and this is usually embedded and injected, conditioning, or like a narrative that they were kind of told and then they on themselves. But it's in that kind of false binary where it's like, it's me or you. It's either I be good or I be me. And that's not right.
And if
That's totally not right.
and if it goes against your experience, you just can't seem to make peace with it in your experience. It really, but at the same time, you're trying to stay in a positive frame of mind. There becomes this underlying resentment underneath, because you've got tension and conflict between these different parts of yourself. And so what I would do in the therapy, that's a very common dynamic when we're working with clients, is we're hearing them speak about parts of themselves that feel in conflict. And so we just name that. You say, I hear a part of you that's saying this, and I'm hearing a part of you that's saying that. And then it's almost as if they come and they share the space with one another. And just in you naming these different parts, they lose that they over time it loses that sense of that conflict between them, and they start to almost relate to one another, and you can almost make peace with it. I mean, that's something that's very common that comes up in the therapy room.
Yeah. And I think what's an important energetic maybe thing to note here is actually when people will identify things within themselves as parts. This can be, and this is just something for us to kind of hold and just inquire about, an objectification, because it's really not a noun, these things, they're not like physical entities, not separate things, and using that kind of languaging can oftentimes reinforce that, even though we're talking about different parts coming together. But it's like, I like to use process, and I know you like that word too. When you say it's a process, and perhaps there's very good reason why that part or process is there in the first place. Now we can begin to have a whole paradigm shift. It's not as this person hurt me and then he split me, and then now I'm in this mess,
Mm.
for example. And then I'm blaming God because God does and knows and wills all things. Okay, but there's also another perspective where this person did this to you, and then you decided to protect yourself and develop this process of shielding yourself or guarding yourself in this specific way, in this adaptive kind of mechanism, coping strategy or of sorts.
Mm.
And that being a type of tawfiq, a type of strength, a type of agency there, that's God given. And now it's just being able to allow the next step of that God given grace, which is to actually realize, okay, whatever happened is over. It's safe now. How can we begin to connect back to the deepest part of ourselves, not having to use the part as like a crutch, and begin to really find that spontaneous, vital spring within of energy, of love, of connection, of creativity, of longing for God and healthy relationships, and allow that to spring forth via that compassion and non-judgment that we're talking about.
Yeah.
But just something, I know, just for people out there, it's an interesting kind of inquiry when you're doing your self-reflection, your shadow work, whatever, to not identify things so much, because then as objects, as parts, because then you can really begin to kind of foster that disconnection. But when you see them all as energy in motion and wisdom being embedded in all of these different dynamics, you can really begin to appreciate. Really, people will begin to really, as they begin to understand, I did that. As a 3-year-old, having to go through, war, civil war in my country, and me having a mother who was totally dysregulated and having no father, and there was bombs. I remember being afraid and having these experiences, and then realizing all of these adaptations that came on from that experience, for example, were something that she did unconsciously as a 3-year-old, never being taught how to do that. And it was intuitive, and she protected herself, and it maintained. It stayed there. It became maladaptive, and she kind of outgrew it, and that's what she was doing work about. But just to recognize, wow, this thing probably saved my life. What an amazing thing. What a rahmah. And I often say this thing, of Rumi's line of Rumi, the wound is where the light enters. And it's such a powerful line. Such a powerful, because it's like it's a total inversion of like disease being bad, or struggling and mushahada, and like these things, bad things, pain and suffering and grief. They're not necessarily bad. Of course, we don't want people to suffer, and I don't mean to denigrate people's experiences or bypass them or delegitimize them. But there is, as believers, an understanding that the affair of the believer is always good, and there's always wisdom and mercy. And that can be difficult to access sometimes, and I totally understand that. But for us, as we heal, we can really begin to tap into that and see how that's working within us. That's really powerful. That can be very powerful, and they can bring up so much gratitude for people that, it's amazing.
That's our cosmological map, that we understand that. It's just obviously, and that's a big blessing as Muslims, that we understand that. But it's obviously, like you said, that's why most people who turn up to therapy are obviously really struggling with that. They want to almost be able to tap into that.
Yeah, exactly.
They know cognitively that they should have, that there's a wisdom in why things happen, but the phenomenological experience is just, they can't seem to make peace with that.
Yeah. It's not an intellectual thing. I often, even atheists that, people struggling with their faith, and, and their parents will tell me, hey, my college kid is struggling with his faith. Can you talk to him? And they're thinking, yeah, we have some books back there. Maybe like you can like give him some stuff, family, friends of ours, whatever they know. I tell them, listen, I'll see him, but as a client, I'm not going to just throw hadith at them, because they know it's not an intellectual dilemma that they're in. It's emotional. And that's been the case 100% of the time with people that are struggling with faith, and they describe the logical inconsistencies and blah, 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 science. And it's not anything like that. It's more the emotional. And the more that they're able to reconcile those things, the more all of that darkness just fizzles out.
And you'll see the prophetic sort of a demonstration of that is sometimes the Prophet, if he felt it was right, he would almost offer the way we should look at things. So when he saw the woman crying at the grave of her son, he does say initially, he says, be conscious of God, and be patient. But he noticed it, so he sends in a signal, but as soon as she reacts back and says, you don't know what I'm going through, he realizes this woman's in pain. He leaves it. He steps back. He says she needs time. She needs space. And sometimes it's in that silence that the person can actually develop reflection, because she reflects after that.
Yeah.
Because she didn't, he didn't respond back and fight her. And they even say that in Maharim al-Lisan, they say one of the haram things for you to do is if you see someone who's anxious and in turmoil, and you go to them and remind them of God, and that they're going to curse God because of it, because of it. This is it's haram for you to even offer that. Yeah. So you've almost got to be conscious of the state of the person and know what's appropriate. So we all know what the ideal is, but then we've got to almost know what's appropriate for that person. And so we see the Prophet, for example, Nu'ayman, who was an incredibly troubled person. He was an alcoholic, but he was a prankster, and he used to do all these things. The Prophet was very light-hearted with him, and almost entertained his shenanigans,
his antics,
because he knew that where this person was, and he was meeting him where he's at, and like the community almost gave face to do these. He struck Uthman in the prayer. He got the blind man to strike Uthman in the prayer. And then he found it was Nu'ayman. He just said, leave it. This, you've got to understand where this person's at. So they out in many different variegated ways with people, according to, they understood their people. And that's the thing is that one of the biggest problems today in trauma and why it's so widespread is because of the lack of community and the ability to support one another and to feel the holding of the community. And so we just need to recognize that we're at a disadvantage, and why we're having to use, have these spaces and these different approaches, because we're on the back foot. We're not in the situation. We're not don't have the luxury of community like people of the past had. And so we have to really deal with this in a specialized and sensitive manner, because people don't have a holding anymore like they had before.
Yeah, exactly.
So people are very sensitive to go astray religiously because of that. Because in the past, people would have anguish, but eventually they would have to come out of their shell, because they felt they intrinsically in their being felt the holding of the community. That was felt on a level, on a daily level. You knew the community was there for you, and so it's much, people are less likely to question God, I could say. I might even be able to posit. But when we don't feel that, we can't, and we've got no holding, then we will turn in on ourselves, or we will turn it on Allah. It's a very common thing for people to do. And so we have to be conscious of that. And we're dealing with circumstances that people of the past didn't necessarily have to deal with to the degree that we deal with them, because of the lack of community.
Yeah. Lack of community, the lack of nutrition, the lack of good sleep, the lack of healthy food, water, air, without being sprayed with toxins. I mean, this is a time for compassion for ourselves and one another. Absolutely. Because there's so many things, just again, that are not fitri in this world, our Western kind of context here. It's very challenging. It's tremendously challenging for all of us.
And there's one more thing, interestingly, from a personal-centered approach, we're constantly trying to bring it back to the phenomenological experience, like the lived, felt experience of the person, the client. So often what will happen in a session, a client, and this is in line with when people do question God, we don't always have to answer that question. And what I mean by that is, so if I have a client come to me and I see them in anguish, and then they suddenly say to me, what do you think the answer is? So they basically pin me down with a closed question.
Mm.
And in personal-centered approach, we're trying to get to their locus, their internal locus of evaluation. We want them to be able to sort of sit and work things out themselves. So when people almost throw these questions out, like, why has God done this to me? What we do is we name their experience. We don't even have to. So I'll slow down. So someone says, what do you think? And I will say, I really see you questioning yourself there.
Mm.
I don't even have to answer that question.
That's right.
Like, it's really struggling. You'd really like someone else to be able to give you the answer.
Mm.
And then you reflect it back, their experience, and then it continues their processing.
Mm.
And so if someone says to me, why has God done this to me? And say, I can see that you're really struggling to hold this, and you'd almost like some great, you'd like to feel the holding of someone else being able to hold this for you, or you just reflect what you're sensing in the question or the statement of the person, so they can stay in contact with their phenomenological experience.
Yeah.
And so we often don't have to even worry these utterances, to be honest, because we're always reflecting back, must be how you're feeling, so that they can continue their processing and gain and move towards healing.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's the connection really that allows for them to process that. And the trauma is the fragmenting part. So he was talking about trauma in the question. So the trauma itself is what disconnects us from that capacity. And then even if we want connection from Allah, to feel that warmth and feel his maghfirah and all of that, in some way we have to be able to develop our receptivity to that. And that's what you're talking about here. By doing your own work, by going into therapy, by healing in whatever modality you're called to, but really tending to your internal experience and healing these things that have been isolated, or some people have called them outliers, or trying to think of the family systems therapy, languaging. Internal family systems, IFS, he uses outliers or something like that. But these parts of us, he uses parts languaging a lot. And but the more that we're able to really engender some sort of cohesion to these things and allow for that natural flow, again, the vital force is what ties all of this together. When there's connection, the ruh it'll just literally weave all of this, and it's like a outwardly moving flow. So if like we're disconnected from the flow within us, then we're not going to feel the flow of energy around us and all the way up, if you will. But the more, when we can plug in ourselves, when we can plug ourselves in, and then naturally there's a plugging into the greater kind of matrix of energy, of light, of nur, of vital force, of whatever. Now there's a greater sense of community. Now, even if the community is there, I can receive it. I mean, many of us, and it's just something I kind of offer people sometimes when they talk about community not being there and stuff like that. I'm like, would you be open to having a community? Would you be open if you had neighbors talking and visiting each other constantly, and the kids playing, and you having that really intimate type of life with 10 to 20 families? Would you be open to that right now? And it's an interesting question, because most of us are not, probably. We talk about it romantically, and then we maybe have some neighbors that want to talk to us outside when we're shoveling the snow, and all of a sudden we're collapsing. It's like, that's one person. So being able to really open up to that, and then starting in our current situation with my neighbors here, I take the advantage, to when I see them shoveling, well, I'll walk over, I'll talk to them, and I'm trying my best to weave something out here. I'm kind of new to this area too, and just kind of develop something. I know it's not going to be perfect, and I know previously I'd probably be not the most generous neighbor, or the most amiable neighbor, or present neighbor, but it's something that I'm working on personally, right?
You're conscious of it.
I'm conscious of it, and I'll see people, I'll go outside sometimes for a walk, just do a loop, and I'll catch people, and I'll just say, hey, I'm 1582 over here, and
I find that
we'll
one of
build
the
a
best
bond.
ways. I've noticed that, like when I go for a walk in the morning and the evening, that's when people feel most comfortable. Or you're out
Mm,
in the garden. I've noticed that is
mm,
that they don't they don't feel like they're intruding, and they will almost engage you.
yeah,
I've experienced that a lot. Those people in the morning, we're like a club almost. It's like, the
yeah.
ones, it's like an inside club. Like
It is an
you're
encyclopedia.
you're one of us. Like you're willing to get up in the morning and walk your dog, or or whatever. So you're
Yeah,
out here walking with us. We're acknowledging.
yeah, exactly. And that's a kind of community there.
Mm,
I mean, you don't. Yeah, that's a definitely type of community there. I
yeah.
mean, you feel a sense of belonging there. You feel warmth. You feel a type of affinity toward that person. But yeah, just going back to the point, it's like we have to build receptivity and capacity for more connection,
Well,
starting with ourselves.
what's so interesting, what you were talking about just before that was it's almost as if it's almost as if our internal energy can't hold things when we're speaking like that. We all know fundamentally, deeper in our core, most of us, that the right way, that we know that there's a wisdom in things. We know that Allah wants good for us, but where that's the struggle, it's almost the inability for our life force to sit with something, with our experience, and so it almost shoots off and just wants to escape, wants to turn on itself. It's just almost, it can't feel that channel, and that's it can't sit with its experience. So when we're sitting with a client and we're almost reflecting back for them, we're almost we're aiding them and supporting them in staying with their experience.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a really beautiful process, because what it is, you're almost, as you're holding and you're reflecting back to them what it must be like for them, it's almost as if you're helping them maintain present with their, so, and even if they start almost moving away from it,
And
you
they
know
will.
and you'll name that, and
Yeah.
that's that phenomenological experience. You'll
There
say,
you are going off again into story. There you are
yeah,
going off into
I can see that
beating
that was a
yourself
bit
up.
much for you, and you're having to move away, and that feels safe for you to move away.
Yeah,
Yeah. And that, we're not judging, though, just saying that's how you stay safe, and now they're touching back into their experience.
for
So it's
sure.
almost this dynamic of you're helping them almost stay within the folds of their experience, just by reflecting back to them what you're sensing, and offering it to them in a tentative way to see if is that true for you. And even if you're wrong as a therapist, it still gives them a gauge to see, is that, to align that, is that my experience? And then they will assert themselves and say, no, it's not that, it's this actually. And then they
Exactly.
feel their power come back, and they feel they're able to actually stay with their experience, because they've been able to assert themselves and name it for themselves and feel their agency.
Exactly. That's agency. That's what
Mm,
I was thinking the whole time you were saying that as well.
mm,
When you invite them to stay with themselves and to
mm,
understand and to organize things themselves,
mm,
agency builds. It
mm,
it's not this maybe unconscious, overwhelming matrix of darkness that grips me and sucks me down and I'm helpless. And no, there's you can organize it, you can make sense of it, you
mm,
can track the ways that you put pressure on yourself and track the ways that you shame yourself into thinking your needs are undeserving of being met or whatever it is, right?
mm,
And the way you can become more aware, I tell people they want homework, I'm sure you get that too. People want homework from me, and I tell them I don't
mm,
give homework, but one thing I
mm,
will offer you is just to be more curious, inquire about the way that they act in, basically, or act
mm,
out, but the way that they sabotage themselves and the way that they move away from that life force and agency and their internal phenomenological experience. All of that. How do you move away from that? Because that is the heart, that is the life force, that is you, essentially. That's the adult consciousness, we call it. That's what you
mm,
want, and that's what they name at the beginning of every session, basically. They name, that's what I want. Or we try to
mm,
support their inquiry into landing into what they want. And once they
mm,
name it, it's like, okay, now what's coming in the way of that? And it's
mm,
exactly it, just kind of seeing, okay, this is what you want. You've named it and connected to it. And people, even sometimes by naming what they want, naming the process that they're trying to connect to internally, they'll have it. Wow, it feels really good just to be able to put that into words. And yeah, take a
mm,
moment with that, see how it's like for you. And they'll tap into it. And yeah, that feels really good, And then they'll start to you see them kind of move away, and they'll go back into story, or they'll go like, hey, what just happened? I saw you land. I felt like you just kerplunked, kind of just boom. You were with me, and then I just felt like I lost you. Yeah, I went back into my self-sabotage. Yeah, I noticed it. And how is it for you? And just like you said, that's exactly the whole thing. And just tracking, once you find the target, their target that they establish for themselves, how they swerve from it. And it's just constant invitation. It's like, come back, come back and track. I'm not going to force you to come back. I trust you will naturally come back as the space is safe, and as you begin to get your agency back online and all of that, and begin to make sense of what's going on with you. I trust that spontaneous process to happen on its own. I don't have to force it. And it's very interventionist to do that. Even medically, people don't trust the vital force. When people, even naturopaths, will oftentimes intervene against the vital force, intervene against a healing crisis, which is an aggravation of symptoms when the conditions for healing are finally made present. There's an aggravation of sorts. Quite often, it's actually a very good sign. We internally celebrate, when people have healing aggravations, healing crisis. But then it's difficult. It can be a few days of, challenge and headache and malaise and pains and further anxiety, whatever the case may be. But then after that initial aggravation, and there's a serious, tangible amelioration of all the symptoms, or a significant corpus of symptoms. And it's in that trusting the body, trusting the vital force, that once we give the body what it needs fundamentally, whatever it may be, emotionally, it's maybe non-judgmental space and compassion and curiosity on behalf of the therapist. But what if it's also nutrition and removing toxemia and correcting lifestyle patterns, all of that? That trusting that once those things are there, those fitra, foundational fitri elements of the human being that have to be there and can't not be there for the human being to thrive, the trust that that person will come right back into balance. It might take some time, whatever, but they will come back, inshallah. And that's the process. That's all I can hope for, is help people start moving back. Timelines and promises I don't give, but I promise you, and I want you to trust, as I trust, your vital force, as you create the conditions, that you'll be on your way. And then Allah gives tawfiq. Alhamdulillah.
Okay.
Any final thoughts, Didi, before we wrap up for today?
No, I think that's
okay. Alhamdulillah. We'll wrap up there, inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan for joining us again, Sheikh Idris. I hope you all enjoyed that. Inshallah ta'ala, keep us posted with your feedback and your questions, and inshallah we'll catch you all next time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.